I think I'll start reading a couple of pages from last exit. From the last 3 pages of Strike. Harry left the bar a little after 8. He leaned against the wall as he walked, unable to stand, slipping on the icy ground. He leaned against the window of the empty store that had been used as the strike office. He lit a few matches trying to see inside, but he still couldn't see anything. There was nothing to see anyway. He had already taken the radio home. It was once again an empty store with a for rent sign on the door. He walked to the corner, slipping several times, finally having to crawl to the lamppost to help himself stand. He clutched the post for a few minutes, catching his breath. A kid, about 10 years old, from his block, walked over to him and laughed. "You're drunk, Mr. Black." Harry touched him on the head, then stuck his hand under the large collar of the kid's jacket and rubbed the back of his neck. It was very warm, even slightly moist. The kid laughed again. "Hey, your hands are cold. Quit it." Harry smiled his smile and pulled him closer. "Where you going, Joey?" "Up the corner to see the fellas." Harry's hand was warm now, and Joey stopped squirming. "How you like a soda? You buying?" "Yeah, okay." They started slowly up 57th Street, Harry's hand still on the back of Joey's neck. When they had walked a few feet, Harry stopped. They stood still a second, then Harry started walking into the empty lot. "Hey, where you going?" "Over there, come on, I want to show you something." "What do you want to show me? Come on." They crossed the lot and went behind the large advertising sign. "What's here?" Harry leaned against the billboard for a moment, then lowered himself to his knees. Joey watched him, his hands in his jacket pockets. Harry reached up and opened Joey's fly and pulled out his cock. "Hey, what are you doing?" Trying to back away. Harry clutched Joey by the legs and put Joey's small, warm cock in his mouth, his head being tossed from side to side by Joey's attempts to free himself. But he clung to Joey's legs, keeping his cock in his mouth and muttering, "Please, please." Joey pounded him on the head and tried to kick him with his knee. Let me go, you fucking freak." Harry felt the fists on his head, the cold ground under his knees, felt the legs squirming and his hands starting to cramp from holding him so tight. And he felt the warm prick in his mouth and the spittle dribbling down his chin. And Joey continued to scream, squirm, and pound his head until he finally broke loose and ran from the lot, still screaming, to the Greeks. When Joey broke loose, Harry fell on his face, his eyes swelling and tears starting to ooze and roll down his cheeks. He tried to stand but kept falling to his knees, then flat on his face, still muttering, "Please." A minute later, Joey, Vinny, and Sal and the rest of the guys from the Greeks came running down 2nd Avenue to the lot. Harry was almost standing, holding on to the billboard, when they reached him. There he is! The son of a bitch tried to suck me off!" Harry let go of the billboard and started to extend his arms when Vinny hit him on the cheek. "You fucking freak." Someone else hit him on the back of the neck, and Harry fell to the ground, and they kicked and stomped him, Joey squeezing in between to kick him too. And Harry barely moved, barely made a sound beyond the whimpering. A couple of the guys picked him up and stretched his arm across one of the crossboards of the sign and hung his arms with all their weight and strength until Harry's arms were straining at the shoulder sockets, threatening to snap. And they took turns punching his stomach and chest and face until both eyes were drowned with blood. Then a few of the guys joined the two pulling on his arms, and they all tugged until they heard a snap. And then they twisted his arms behind him, almost tying them in a knot. And when they let go, he continued to hang from the bar, then slowly started to slide down and to one side, until one arm jerked around the bar and flopped back and forth like a snapped twig, held only by a thin piece of bark, and his shoulder jerked up until it was almost on a level with the top of his head. And the guys watched Harry Black as he slowly descended from the billboard, his arms flapping back and forth, until his jacket got caught on a splinter, and the other arm spun around and he hung, impaled, and they hit and kicked him until the splinter snapped and Harry descended to the ground. Harry lay still, sobbing. He cried and screamed aloud, "Ah!" that was muffled as his face fell back into the dirt of the lot. He tried to raise his head but could not. He could only turn it slightly, so he rested on a cheek. He was able to open his eyes slightly, but was blinded by the blood. He yelled again. He heard the sound loud inside his head. "God! Oh, God!" He yelled, but no sound came from his mouth. He heard his voice loud in his head, but only a slight gurgle came from his lips. "God! God! You suck cock!" The moon neither noticed nor ignored Harry as he lay at the foot of the billboard, but continued on its unalterable journey. The guys washed up in the Greeks, drying their hands with toilet paper and tossing the wet wads at each other, laughing. It was the first real kick since blowing up the trucks, the first good rumble since they dumped that doggy. They sprawled at the counter and at the tables and ordered coffee and... I'm going to read the last page of the book. The sun rose behind the Gowanus Parkway, lighting the oil-filmed water of the Gowanus Canal and the red bricks of the project. Church bells announced the beginning of services. Ada looked out her window for a while before starting breakfast. Louis got up planning on getting out as early as possible, alone, and going for a ride. Irene woke up before Mike and laid in bed listening to him grumble and wondering how he would feel when he woke up. Vinny got up first and yelled for the kids to keep quiet, yeah, and dragged Mary by the arm across the bed and told her to get up. Nancy woke, scratched her crotch, then smelled her finger, and yelled for the kids to shut up. When old Abe got home, the kids were sitting at the table yelling and eating, and he told them to be quiet. He wanted to sleep, and went into the bedroom, staggering slightly, his eyes red and barely open. He carefully took off his clothes and hung them up, put on his hairnet, and went to bed. Nancy came in and lay down beside him and started tickling his asshole. He shoved her away, laughing at her, and told her to get the fuck out and leave him alone. She told him she wasn't going, that she was going to have some cock, and he backhanded her across the face and told her to go get a banana, and she called him a no-account black nigger bastard, and he punched her in the motherfucking face, knocking her off the bed, and told her to get her ass out of there, or I'll bust you apart, woman. And he rolled her out of the room. She crawled out to the kitchen and pulled herself up, holding on to the edge of the sink, still yelling he was a black nigger bastard, then let cold water run over her head. Her daughter came over to help her, and Nancy continued yelling, and then the frustration started her crying, and her daughter told her not to cry. Jesus loves us, Mommy. Nancy told her to get the fuck away from her. Abraham slept. Here's a short little poem that I read for Henry. It's kind of the shortest biography that I know of Mr. Rollins. It's called Autumn Ode. Jesus Christ, God, what kind of world is this? Life sucks and my girlfriend don't. Reminds you of an old song, Henry. Better luck next time. Here's my son's favorite story. Television is a little different where I come from. First of all, it's everywhere, and it's cancerous and hideous. It's just... I myself don't have a TV set, but we have a kind of a union called the American Federation of Teachers. And they put out a special TV issue of their monthly publication. And they foolishly asked me to write something about television. So this is it. It's called A Little Respect. Harry pushed the papers on his desk into piles, any old pile, then rushed to the elevator. He hated those last-minute phone calls. He never could figure out why people waited until 5 to 5 to call. He hurried to the elevator, looking at his watch. He could still make the 5:20 if there were no more hang-ups. The first two elevators went right past his floor because they were filled, and he groaned inwardly as the others waiting complained. He kept looking at his watch, but it didn't seem to do any good, so he lit a cigarette, and an elevator stopped and the doors opened. He squeezed himself in the elevator and went directly to the ground floor, non-stop. He rushed to the subway and stood on the platform, constantly looking at his watch, complaining loudly to himself about the service, and what in the hell is keeping the train, wishing he could light a cigarette. The more he looked at his watch, the more convinced he became that he would miss the 5:20 and end up on the damn 5:30, the cattle car. Eventually the train arrived, and he pushed and was shoved into the car. He was jammed so close to the guy in front of him that the guy's mustache kept tickling Harry's nose, and whoever it was behind him must have had spaghetti and meatballs for lunch with extra garlic. He wondered what time it was. Harry fluttered out of the train when they reached the terminal and rushed from time to time, almost running, toward the proper track. He glanced at his watch and the clocks on the wall and knew it was hopeless. It was already 5:21, and it would take him at least a few more minutes to get there, no matter how fast he walked, and God knows that if they ever left on time, they would today. When he got there early, never. But today, the end of the train was just barely visible when he got to the track. He looked at the dark tunnel for a moment, feeling and listening to his heart pound. He bought a paper and waited. A cattle car. That's what the 5:30 is, a cattle car. And not only that, the 5:30 doesn't know what a schedule is, not even a nodding acquaintance. Who knows what time I'll get home? When he reached the station, he almost stopped for a moment to breathe the air, but instead continued to the bus stop, sneaking a few looks at his watch. The bus was there in a matter of minutes, and thank God he got a seat. He read about a flood, a hatchet murder, an earthquake that killed 10,000 people, and relaxed. The short walk to the house was almost pleasant. He looked forward to sitting and relaxing for a few minutes, if possible, before dinner. The street was relatively quiet enough to be able to hear the birds. Harry liked to hear the birds. It was so bucolic, like the city was a million miles away. Oh, so nice. He opened the door of his home and was immediately assaulted by the sounds of machine guns, cannons, and the screams of planes. His 10-year-old son Milton was sitting on the floor in the living room, surrounded by a few empty bowls and numerous candy wrappers. There were crumbs of crackers, popcorn, potato chips everywhere. Harry stuck his head in the doorway. "Hi, Milty, how are you?" Milton stared at the screen. Harry looked at him for a moment, then raised his voice slightly. "I said hello, how are you?" Milton stared at the screen. Harry stared at his son, but could not outlast him. "Turn it down, Milty." Milton stared at the screen. "Milty, I said to turn it down. It's too loud." Harry's head was raging, but he just stood over his son, squeezing his newspaper, raising his voice just a little each time he spoke. His son continued to stare at the screen. Finally, there was a commercial break, and Harry tried again. "Milton, lower the volume." Milton finally acknowledged his father's presence by giving him his best Fonzie posture without getting up. "Be cool, huh?" "I'll be cool," grabbing for the control unit, and Milton holding tight with both hands. "Give me that, you look out, you jerk, you want to break it? I'll break your head, you little..." Harry's wife, Maya, yelled from the kitchen, "Is that you, Harry?" He stood up. "Yes, it's me." The movie suddenly came back on with an artillery barrage that caused Harry to drop the control unit. He retreated to the kitchen. Milton stared at the screen. Maya was turning back the aluminum foil on the TV dinners. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. A special treat." "Yeah? Your favorite, Salisbury steak." Harry nodded. "With homemade water?" "What?" "Nothing." "What was all that noise? Were you yelling at Milty again?" "Yelling? How could you tell? I heard you." "How could you hear me over the racket?" "Maya, I tell you, something's got to be done." "Done? About what?" "About what? About Milty." "Why, what did he do now?" "What did he do? That's it. He doesn't do anything." "He doesn't say hello. He doesn't say goodbye. He doesn't say anything. He just sits in front of the television like a blob." "He likes it, Harry. And anyway, it keeps him out of trouble." "I'm his father. He should say hello. Is that something terrible, to want your son, your only child, thank God, to say hello?" "I work all day. I work hard, like a slave." Maya was nodding her head and continued to nod as she put the dinners back in the oven, Harry following her around the kitchen. "I work like a slave to give my family a nice house in the suburbs so you don't have to live in the crowded city. Am I asking for trumpets and kettle drums when I come home? Am I asking for a bugle call? All I'm asking for is a little consideration, that's all. Is it asking so much to have him say hello? I always say hello. You say hello, but does he? Maybe I should get a tape recorder and have him say once, only once, 'Hello, Dad,' and then you'll play it when I come home." Maya shrugged. "Excuse me, Harry, I want to set the table." Maya set the table, and Harry continued to follow her around. "I'm going to make some changes around here. I'm going to get some respect from my son, do you hear?" "I hear you, Harry, and you're right. You should get some respect. Excuse me while I get the silverware." "From now on, when I get home, he's to turn that thing off and say hello." Maya nodded. "How was your day?" My day? The days I survive very well. It's the nights that aren't so good." The timer started ringing, and Maya took the dinners from the oven. "Tell Milty it's time to eat." Harry went into the living room, grim determination stealing his resolve. "Come to dinner, Milton. Bring it here." "What do you mean, bring it here?" Milton slowly turned his head and looked at his father as if he were an imbecile, then turned back to the screen. Harry stared at his son for a moment, then spun around and went back to the kitchen. "He won't come to dinner. He isn't hungry. He wants to be served in there." Maya shrugged. "Let him eat in there. I'll fix a tray so..." "What do you mean, let him..." "Harry, don't get so excited. It's bad for your digestion. Here, sit and relax." Maya pushed Harry into his seat and then quickly fixed the tray for Milton and took it to him. She came back and served the food and sat and smiled at Harry. "Come on, Harry. Eat while it's hot." Harry was continually shaking his head. "Bring it here. Bring it here." All the cannons and machine guns in the movie seemed to be exploding in his head. Through the trauma of the cannonading, he heard his son's voice, and Maya got up and cut a big piece of pie and put a big scoop of ice cream on it and took it to Milton. Harry was eating. He could feel the food. He chewed. He swallowed. He must be eating. Maya sat down. He could see her, but somehow she wasn't there. Wasn't. Thoughts stabbed his head. They broke through his skull, pierced his nose and ears. They spewed forth from his mouth and wrapped themselves around his head and squeezed at his throat. Some respect. You can say, "Hello, I'm your father. I work all day." The 5:30's a cattle train for what? A broadside of guns and planes, and a little respect. I don't have to listen. There'll be changes. Harry, you're all right. Yes, some changes, and then respect without the bombs. Harry stood up, tall and straight and stiff. Maya looked at him as she continued eating. Right now we'll start with the changes. And he strode forth from the kitchen, Maya frowning, and into the living room, past the blob of Milton sitting, staring, and yanked the TV cord from the plug and started wheeling the set out of the room. Milton stared at the dark screen for a moment, then yelled, "Hey, what are you doing?" "Doing? I'm making some changes." "Hey, Ma! Ma!" Maya rushed into the living room. "What's wrong?" Milton was yanking at his father's arm, hitting him, tugging at the set and yelling, "No! No! Give me the set!" "Be careful I don't give you what you deserve." "What's going on? Harry, what—" "Out of my way! Out!" He pushed his son aside, and Maya automatically stepped aside as Harry pushed the set out the front door and dumped it on the lawn. Maya and Milton watched as he went into the garage. From now on there'll be changes. "I'll get a hello." He came out of the garage with a can of gasoline and an axe. He continued laughing hysterically and screaming as he attacked the set with the axe, the tube exploding and huge hunks of glass going everywhere. Harry getting a few cuts on his hands that started bleeding. Maya and Milton screaming, Milton yanking on his mother's arm, "Stop him! Stop him!" and then ran into the house still screeching and called the police. A few neighbors peeked out of the windows and then came over to watch Harry chop up the TV set, laughing and laughing, little splotches of blood swinging from his hands as he chopped. Then more neighbors came out of their homes as phone calls were made to spread the news, and they came closer and closer until almost 100 people were lined up on the sidewalk and street, watching Harry as he finally stopped chopping and poured the gasoline over the shattered set and tossed a match in it, and the fire started with a loud poof. "Burn, you bastard! Burn! Burn! Burn!" And he started jumping up and down, and Milton started to run toward the fire, and Maya held him back, and a couple of the neighbors' children screamed, "Put it out! Put it out!" And their parents started chanting, "Burn! Burn! Burn! Burn!" And then more of the neighbors started applauding and coming closer to the fire, cheering Harry as he continued chanting, "Burn, you bastard! Burn, you bastard!" And a siren was heard in the distance and got louder and louder before the cops got to Harry and Maya. The fire engine came screeching around the corner, and 2 firemen came running over with extinguishers as one cop was asking Maya what was going on, and Milton jumped up and down screaming, "Kill him! Kill him!" Then suddenly ran into the house and got his video camera, and the other cop was trying to drag Harry away from the fire, and he kept shaking the cop off, yelling, "Leave me alone! You have no right! Burn, you bastard! Now he'll say hello!" And the cop dragged harder and harder, and Harry resisted stronger and stronger, and finally the cop had it. "You'd better take it easy, buddy, or I'll break your head open," and then called his partner, and they grabbed Harry and twisted his arms as he flailed and jumped and screamed, and the 3 of them rolled on the lawn, the firemen telling them to look out and get out of the way as the neighbors applauded Harry and booed the cops and firemen. And the cops had torn almost all the clothes off Harry and finally got him face down on the lawn, Harry bruised and bleeding, and one had his nightstick pressed hard against the back of Harry's neck as the other one cuffed his hands behind his back. And Milton was busy filming the scene on his camera. And Maya stood quietly watching as the cops dragged Harry, still laughing hysterically, to the patrol car, and the firemen spread the ashes and made certain the fire was out before leaving. Milton spent the night with his grandparents when his mother visited Harry. He hooked his tape machine to their TV set and watched the cops drag his father away, smiling and shaking his fist at the screen, "Kill him! Kill him! Kill him!" Then played the tape over and over and over. I'm going to read a couple of pages from a book I'm working on now, a novel. The working title of the book is Seeds of Pain, Seeds of Love. And these couple of pages I call the pool room. Maybe you'd call it a billiard parlor here. I guess I was 14 that Sunday my mother came up to the pool room to get me. Jesus, I hated her for that. In front of all the guys, practically dragging me out of the pool room, everyone looking at this kid being yelled at by his mommy. But what could I do? I couldn't hit her or knock her down the stairs. I had to go with her, the marrow of my bones burning with humiliation. We were supposed to meet on the corner about 11:30 when she got out of church. I knew she'd be there. I peeked out the window a few times and she was always there. I was hoping she'd give up and just go home, but we were supposed to go to the diner and eat lunch together, like we usually did on Sunday now that my father had gone back to sea. But she wouldn't leave. She just waited and waited, and I was hoping I could outlast her, but I couldn't. And she finally got so angry she came up the stairs to the pool room, and suddenly she was there, in the doorway, yelling. And then I was on my way down the stairs, my mind and heart knowing that everyone was laughing at me and calling me a mama's boy, and Jesus Christ, I wanted to die or hit her or something to redeem myself. Christ, I just wanted to play pool with my friends, and she's yelling about coming down and telling her. She waited on the street corner for an hour, and she was always asking me questions like that, like why didn't I tell her? Why didn't I come down and let her know? Why didn't I this and that? And for Christ's sake, I don't know why. And it seemed like every time I wanted to do something or tried to tell her something, her feelings got hurt. Or at least I thought they would, so I never said anything. Like, how in the hell do you say things like, how do you tell your mother you'd rather spend the afternoon shooting pool with your friends than meet her for lunch after church? It wasn't my fault my father was at sea. It wasn't my fault I was an only child. It wasn't my fault this or my fault that, but I was always so goddamn guilty. Jesus Christ, I was guilty. It seemed like the entire universe was dependent upon me for its well-being, and I couldn't cut it. My insides broiled and raged, yet I somehow always felt like the little kid who was so totally powerless over the tyranny of the adult world. It seemed that no matter how hard I knocked on the door, the fucking thing would never open. Fuck it. The world still doesn't make any sense to me, so how could I make any sense out of it then? Especially when there were no names for things. And if there were, what difference would it have made? Would it have helped me to know I felt frustrated, trapped, lost, alienated, guilty, lonely, sad, and frightened? I remember when I would be hit with my father's razor strap. Good, solid leather. My mother wielded it. She had to. He didn't do much but yell. And she believed in it. She believed that if she didn't whack me with that fucking thing, that I would never learn. Learn what? Who the fuck knows? Learn not to do the things I was being whipped for doing, whatever they were. He would just yell and she had to inflict the punishment. And there always seemed to be such an endless build-up to the whippings. There always seemed to be an eternity from the time I was sent to my room to wait for the whipping, and I could hear her walk down the hall to the bathroom to get the strop, and then back to my room, and she would grab me by the upper arm with the grip of a bulldog, and no matter how much I twisted and turned and yelled and begged, she held my arm as if she were welded to it, and managed to talk the whole time she whipped me with that goddamn thing. And I guess I was supposed to understand what it was all about, and not do it again, but it never made any sense to me, and I can't remember one word of it now. Not one fucking word. I loved my mother, and I could never understand why I was doing whatever I did that was so terrible I forced my mother to beat me. and why he just laid on the couch in his undershirt and shorts and yelled at her to take care of me, to straighten me out, or some fucking thing like that. Yet he loved me. I found that out that night he carried me down to the taxi cab. I was taller than him by that time and must have looked funny as hell hanging over his shoulder. Never thought of that. Too much pain. No embarrassment when the people on the street looked at us. No humiliation, just pain. And he loved me. He really loved me. I was 14 that night, too. A couple of weeks after Pearl Harbor. A few months later, he went back to sea. This little section I call Tomorrow. What a glorious luxury to believe in tomorrow. All the pain of today is bearable, whether over a 10-cent pocket knife or a ride to hell. All things are always possible tomorrow. There is always something that will happen that will change everything. God, how we cling to that magic moment when it will all come together. Jesus, how many magic birthdays were there when I was a kid? The magic age when I would finally be able to do something I longed so desperately to do. And I guess they all would prove I was a man. To eat at the table with Mom and Pop, to go to school, to be 6, the first magical number. To struggle through my teens when I would really find out the secret. And then there it is, your 13th birthday and nothing happens. Nothing. And 16, that was a big one. Then 18, old enough to drink legally, a real man. Then 21, a voter. Then the distant 35. Where do these crazy numbers come from? Nothing changes. Going from one bar to another because the action is always at the next bar, the next party. That's where it will be happening. That's where she'll be. Jesus, I believed it. I fucking believed it. 35. 35. That was such a magical number. God, it's so funny now. But I believe it so completely, so thoroughly then. All my life I believed that if I had 35 cents, I'd really be a big guy. It had the aura of a fortune. 35 cents. You can't even get a nickel candy bar today for 35 cents. Yet then I got 35 cents of my own, my very own. Actually, it was 37 cents, I think. I was about 8 or thereabouts, maybe 10. We'd been living over the candy store on 3rd Avenue for at least a year. Grandparents moved. It was to Senator Street, below 3rd. I got the deposit bottles to cash. 37 cents. 37 big cents. Must have been springtime. That's when people moved, mostly. I remember I didn't have heavy clothes on, just a shirt, I think. I stood in front of the candy store, jiggling that money in my pocket, that veritable fortune, and nothing changed. The world just went on like it always had and always would. Nothing changed. Don't know what I expected, but I know I expected something. Surely I would grow a few inches at least. I would be looked upon with respect. Maybe I should have told someone I had 37 cents. Maybe it should not have been such a secret. Perhaps I should have taken out an ad in the New York Times or on the radio. Let the shadow announce that I now had 37 cents and was filing my application for manhood. Well, whatever. I don't even know what I spent it on. I suppose candy, ice cream. Could sure buy a lot of candy for 37 cents then. Could stay sick for a day on 37 cents. Beer was still a nickel. And free lunch. Cold cuts, pickles, bread, cheese, all kinds of stuff. Used to have to go to the bars and get my old man home a lot then. That was a job all us kids had. Go to the bar and try and get him to leave and come home. Many, many times at night sometimes, until maybe it was too late. Mostly he drank in the bar on the corner of 72nd Street and 3rd, just a couple of doors away. Just the Jewish butcher shop between us and the Irish bar. Boyles. Kaplan was the butcher. Went to school with their son, Irving. He was called Itchy. Boyles had 2 rooms, one with the bar, the other had a few tables and a shuffleboard. It was an awesome-looking game to me then. Many, many years later, I played the game a few times, and it was fun. But then it seems like I wasn't much taller than the board. There were times when I didn't mind going to get my father because I knew I'd get a drink of beer. Other times it was an overwhelming embarrassment, especially when he staggered and I had to try and hold him up. I loved the sound and the smell of the bar. It seemed happy. Sometimes he'd buy sodas for the kids, waving his arms and calling them into the candy store, staggering, mumbling, slobbering, looking like his face was draining down his neck. I used to stand back from the group feeling as if I wasn't invited. Think I was ashamed of him at those moments, though I idolized him and wanted so desperately to be like him. I used to brag how he would go to work with a hangover. I always thought that made him a real man, going to work with a hangover. I didn't know then that he drank away many good jobs. I didn't know my mother was trying to figure out how to pay the rent and buy food when he was buying the kids those sodas. But I did know I was afraid of the fights, the yelling and screaming, lying in bed at night when he wasn't home, my body tensed, not knowing when the door might slam open and he would bounce off the walls of the narrow hallway that led past my room to the rest of the apartment. He wasn't in the bar every night. Many nights he was home and would lay on the couch in pants and undershirt, and we would listen to the radio. I remember how he smelled. I also remember the day he bought our big radio with push buttons. It was a real big deal. It's still in the cellar of their house. We got it on 5th Avenue, just off 69th Street, not far from the electric company office where we paid the bill. They were the first to have a door that opened with an electric eye, at least in our neighborhood. As kids, we played with the electric eye. Door open, door closed, door open, door closed. And giggle and laugh and screech and run, yeah, run. But the running's over. Simply ran out of space. Got our big radio just a few stores down 5th. Pop had to run a wire from the roof to our window to hook up to the radio as an aerial. We lived on the top floor, so it was easy, I guess. 4 floors up, 3 flights of stairs, 16 steps in each flight, 8 in one direction and 8 in the opposite direction. Used to run up and down those steps dozens of times each day, sometimes with skates on. But we used to listen to the radio, my father on the couch on one side of the room, my mother sitting in her chair on the other side, sewing, or sometimes doing the ironing. I'd lie on the floor in the middle, right in front of the radio. Sometimes my father would wrestle with me and rub his knuckles on my head, and I would screech and he'd be laughing and my mother would yell at us to stop. But I didn't want him to because it was the only time we had any contact. It was almost the only communication we had until just before his death and the first couple of days after. We'd talk about Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and later on DiMaggio and Mantle, and after that there was just awkward silence or self-conscious laughter. Once, when I was in my early 20s, we were the supers in a 22-unit apartment building, and I was in the basement with him. It had a coal-burning furnace, and he had just finished wheeling a supply of coal from the bin to the boiler room. He was stoned. Old Granddad, 100 proof bourbon, his favorite thirst quencher. He could barely stand, and he put his arm around my shoulder and waved his other hand toward the cellar. "Everything I have is yours." Jesus, thanks loads. What a fucking legacy. Schlepping tons of coal from one end of the cellar to the other, then tossing it in that goddamn furnace. You're all fucking heart, Pop. Not until much later, again just before his death, did he ever tell me he loved me. I guess that day in the basement was the closest he came to it until many years later. I remember the darkness and the smell of that basement that day, and the smell of booze on his breath and seeping through his pores. I smiled and said, "I know." I guess I was acknowledging the words that would not come until many years later. I remember his hand on my shoulder, his arm around my neck. I've told that anecdote many times and always with a chuckle, never with the simple acknowledgement that it meant so much to me, that I wanted him to keep his arm and hand there forever. I could never acknowledge to him or anyone else how much that moment meant to me. A huge, dimly lit gray basement, cool cement, a hot furnace, and a stumbling attempt at communication. He could not say what was in his heart, nor did I, and the story is always told with a chuckle. He was a staggering, falling down drunk, but his hand and his arm were light and warm and friendly and comforting. When I was 13, just a few weeks after Pearl Harbor, I had appendicitis, and my father carried me down those 3 flights of stairs to the cab that took us to the hospital. And I remember how I was suddenly overwhelmed with the fact that he loved me. I was a big kid, taller than him by this time, and he carried me down those stairs, holding me tight, rushing down as fast as safety would allow, and I have no memory of pain at that time. My head was hanging over his shoulder, and I was vaguely aware of the steps rapidly going away, of the sudden turn on each landing, and in my memory it was silent, not only no words, but no sound from his feet. I had been in severe pain for many hours, doubled over, and it was gone for those moments on the stairs. My arms were wrapped around his neck, and I was overwhelmed with the intensity of his love. He loves me. He loves me. I remember telling my mother after the operation that my father loves me. I think I told her that many times, and even from time to time in the years following. My father loves me. And I guess I spent my time trying to get him to say that before that night, and then again after. I don't know. To this day, I do not know. Memory is so goddamn selective. Depending on what I want to prove, I bring forth events and believe they are true. But I don't really know what it was I was looking for then. I do not know what that kid, who was not me, wanted from that man. But it feels today, now, that I spent a lifetime trying to find my father. He was right there, lying on the couch in his undershirt listening to the radio, telling me to be quiet so he could listen. Yet it seems there was always this goddamn barrier between us. That kid must have felt it, must have wondered what he was doing wrong. He could see the man lying on the couch or sitting deathly still in the chair, trying to survive a hangover, but he couldn't find him. Jesus Christ, why couldn't I have found you in bed with some woman or something as simple and painless? How do we ever survive the confusion of trying to find what's right in front of us? I want to read a couple of pages from a book I wrote many years ago called Last Exit to Brooklyn. I'm going to read the first 3 pages of a section of the book called The Queen is Dead. Georgette was a hip queer. He didn't try to disguise or conceal it with marriage and man's talk, satisfying her homosexuality with the keeping of a secret scrapbook of pictures of favorite male actors or athletes, or by supervising the activities of young boys, or visiting Turkish baths or men's locker rooms, leering slyly while seeking protection behind a carefully guarded guise of virility, fearing that moment at a cocktail party or in a bar when this front may start crumbling from alcohol and be completely disintegrated with an attempted kiss or groping of an attractive young man, and being repelled with a punch and rotten fairy, followed with hysteria and incoherent apologies and excuses and running from the room, but took a pride in being a homosexual by feeling intellectually and aesthetically superior to those, especially women, who weren't gay. Look at all the great artists who are fairies. And with the wearing of women's panties, lipstick, eye makeup, this including occasionally gold and silver stardust on the lids, long marcelled hair, manicured and polished fingernails, the wearing of women's clothes complete with padded bra, high heels and wig. One of her biggest thrills was going to Bop City dressed as a tall, stately blonde. She was 6 feet 4 inches in heels. In the company of a Negro, he was a big, beautiful black bastard. And when he floated in, all the cats in the place jumped and the squares bugged. We were at a crazy pad before going and were blasting like crazy. And we're up so high that I just didn't give a shit for anyone, honey, let me tell you. And the occasional wearing of a menstrual napkin. She was in love with Vinny and rarely came home while he was in jail, but stayed uptown with her girlfriends, high most of the time on Benzedrine and marijuana. She had come home one morning with one of her friends after a 3-day tea party, with her makeup still on, and her older brother slapped her across the face and told her that if he ever came home like that again, he'd kill him. She and her friend ran screaming from the house, calling her brother a dirty fairy. After that, she always called to see if her brother was in before going home. Her life didn't revolve, but spun centrifugally around stimulants, opiates, Johns, who paid her to dance for them in women's panties, then ripped them off her. Bisexuals who told their wives they were going out with the boys and spent the night with Georgette, she trying to imagine they were Vinny. The freakish precipitate coming to the top. When she heard that Vinny had been paroled, she went to Brooklyn, first buying 10 dozen Benzedrine tablets, and sat in the Greeks all night, following Vinny everywhere and trying to get him alone. She bought him coffee and sat on his lap and asked him to go for a walk. He would refuse and tell her there's plenty of time, sweet chips, maybe later. Georgette would wiggle on his lap, play with his earlobes, feeling like a young girl on her first date. She looked at him coquettishly. "Let me do you, Vinny," forcing herself to refrain from trying to kiss him, from embracing him, from caressing his thighs, dreaming of the warmth of his groin, seeing him nude, holding her head not too gently, pressing close to him, watching his muscles contract, running her fingertips gently along the tightened thigh muscles. He might even groan at the climax. The feel, taste, smell. "Please, Vinny," the dream almost carrying over the consciousness, the Benzedrine making it even more difficult not to try to animate the dream now. It wasn't fear of being rebuked or hit by him. That could be developed in her mind into a lover's quarrel, ending in a beautiful reconciliation that restrained her. But she knew if done in the presence of his friends, who tolerated more than accepted her, or used her as a means to get high when broke or for amusement when bored, his pride would force him to abjure her completely, and then there would not only be no hope, but perhaps no dream. She put her hand tentatively on the back of his neck, twisting the short hairs. She jumped up as he pushed her and giggled as he patted her on the buttocks. She strutted over to the counter. "May I please have another cup of coffee, Alex, you big Greek fairy?" She put another Benzedrine tablet in her mouth and swallowed it with the coffee. put a nickel in the jukebox, and started wiggling as the tenor sax wailed a blues number. Some of the others in the Greeks clapped in time to the music and yelled, "Go, Georgette, go!" She put her hands behind her head, ellipsed her pelvis slowly, and bumped up to one of the girls who was laughing at her and threw her hip in her face. "Here's one for you, you big bitch." When the music stopped, she sat on a stool at the counter, finished her coffee, spun around a few times on the stool, stopped, stood up holding her hands delicately in front of her in the dramatic manner of a concert singer, and sang Un Bel Dì in a wavering falsetto. Someone laughed and said she should go on the stage. "You have a nice voice, Georgie." "Yeah," from the same girl, "for calling hogs." Georgette turned, put her hands on her hips, leaned her head to one side, and looked at her disdainfully. "What would you know about opera, Miss Cocksucker?" She threw her head back and sauntered out to the street in her finest regal fashion. A little prose poem I wrote a couple of months ago. I'm living in L.A. now, and a friend of mine, a poet named Michael Lally, puts on poetry readings on Wednesday nights, and they have a topic, sort of. And this particular night, the topic was boys and girls together. So, and this is the thing I wrote for this particular night. "You know, Brooklyn, you'd take a murder rap for a piece of ass." Jesus Christ. What a thing to say to a 17-year-old kid. It really hurt my feelings, saying I'd be stupid enough to take a murder rap to get laid. I had just run back to the ship a few feet ahead of an enraged madam, one of her girls, and a Greek cop. But I was a victim of circumstances, really. Ed, the guy who had said that to me, wanted to steal the vase in the waiting room of a whorehouse. He tried to buy it, but the madam said no. So he asked me to keep the one unoccupied girl occupied, and he would pay her. Well, the son of a bitch didn't pay her, and I believed he had, so I just hauled ass. Fortunately, they couldn't get past the guard at the gate, and by the next day I had forgotten what he said. Now that ain't no murder rap. I was 17, been going to sea a couple of years. It seemed to me that wine and whorehouses were an obligation, one I wholeheartedly believed in. Actually, more than 40 years later, I still do. What a great way to spend your teenage years. So what's with this murder rap bullshit? Who would be so fucking dumb? Well, all these years later, I perceive it a little differently. Like suppose the murder rap is AIDS, or one of the less publicized diseases that are almost as incurable and virulent. Suppose that kid of some 40-odd years ago was living today. Jesus Christ, what would the poor fucker do? I was told a stiff dick has no conscience. I guess it has very little awareness, too. I just can't conceive of me, then, asking each and every woman for her latest AIDS test results. Jesus, what would me and Mamie O'Rourke do as we trip the life fantastic on the sidewalks of New York? If that kid was alive right now, he'd be screwed, to coin a phrase. The only thing that's a guarantee is the oral contraceptive. Say no. At 17? Give me a fucking break. How do you say no at any age when a woman is the most important thing in your life? How do you say no when you perceive time as the black, lonely gap between women, the interminable and pointless eternity between one pair of lips and another? My God, how many movies can you see? How many bars can you close? How many walks or cold hip baths? Can fear turn a satyr into a eunuch, a man into stone? I have never been able to say no. How can you say no to your salvation? and women had always been my salvation. I not only could not live without them, I didn't want to live without them. I gave them the power of life and death over me, so naturally I was terrified of them and had to resent them. They might say no, and then where would I be? So I was constantly searching for the right one, the one that would make it better, the one that would fix me, the one that would make my heart sing. And I met her, and oh, did she make my heart sing, and still does. And she loves me, and I bring the breath of spring into her heart. She says ours is the love affair of the century. So we tripped the life fantastic on the sidewalks of L.A. Yet after 15 years, she had to leave. Had to leave before she went crazy or destroyed herself in some way. I guess putting inhuman demands on people forces them to act inhumanly. I was so afraid she would leave me, I forced her out of my life. I used to think the phrase broken heart was a metaphor, but when she left, I discovered it as a physical reality. The pain of the grief was so overwhelming, I made a commitment to myself that I would not seek a replacement. I just did not want or need a rebound situation. So 6 years ago, I found a way to say no, not only for that 17-year-old kid, but for me, today, just for today. Yeah. The tots play ring around Rosie, London bridges falling down, boys and girls together, me and... So I beat the murder rap. I didn't go to the east side, the west side, or all around the town. Yeah, I beat the murder rap. But what will I do for pretty girls now that Suzanne is gone? I'll wrap this up with a little anecdote, a vignette that's also in the most recent book, Song of the Silent Snow. This is something I wrote about 31 years ago called Fat Phil's Day. I used to get out of Sunday school about 10:30 or so and wake up some of the other guys, and we'd wait on the corner for the crap game to start. We had one every Sunday, no matter how cold or how lousy the weather was. And Fat Phil would be out by 8 with his shine box and get everyone going to church from the 9 o'clock Mass to the 11:30. He'd stand on the corner and look poor and neglected, and he'd make out like crazy. If anybody asked him how old he was, he'd knock off 3 years and say 10 and tell them he had to help support the family. He had some line, and the churchgoers really ate it up. Anyway, after he finished shining shoes, he'd come down to 3rd Avenue and get in the game. Usually me and Fritz would play until we only had a dime left and save that for the movies, but sometimes we'd win a few bucks. But this Sunday, Phil got on a hot roll and was cleaning everybody. Danny, a half-assed hustler from 43rd Street, usually came around and bet wrong. But he wasn't there today, so the rest of us had to keep going against the Greek. If Danny was there, we could have jumped on Phil's hot roll, but he wasn't. Anyway, every time Phil threw the dice, he'd throw a natural, or if he got a point, he'd hit it anyway. After about 7 or 8 passes, he was taking all kinds of bets and winning, gagging his point the hard way, over and under 7, anything anybody wanted to lay, and he won. We tried everything to get him off the roll, joning against, then with, gating the dice, but still he'd win. And every time he threw another pass, he'd roar and yell, "Shoot it! Come on, you bastards, fade me. I'm hot. Come on, who's gonna fade me? $50 still open." And somebody'd throw the money down. He'd roll the dice and hit another pass and roar and scoop up the money. and we tried gating the dice every other roll, but he still won, and everybody was going broke. And we started slapping him on the head and taking the polish from his shine box, and he'd run after it and come back and throw the dice and hit another pass and roar that he was going to take us all to the cleaners. And Booby gave him a shot in the arm and told him if he didn't crap out, he'd break his head. And Phil still won, but now he didn't laugh so loud. And every time he picked up the money, we kicked him in the ass or rapped him off the head, but he couldn't lose. He hit 4 for a point, and Sal made him take an even money bet that he wouldn't do it the hard way. And Phil almost cried, but he put his money down and threw the dice, and 2 twos came up. And Sal told him he'd break his shine box over his fat Greek head if he didn't crap out. And Phil said he'd pass the dice, and Sal told him he'd play until he crapped out or we'd kill him. And he picked up the dice and threw another natural, and we were really punching him now. And he almost cried, but still scrambled after the money. And we kicked his ass. You fat son of a bitch. Come on, fellas, leave me alone. Rap, come on. Give me my brush. Rap, please. Another bet. Stop it, guys. Come on, will you? And he covered his head, waiting for us to fade him. And he hit a point. And when he picked up the dice, we rapped him and kicked him, and he stopped pleading with us and started pleading with the dice. Come 7, please, a 7. And he threw him again, and it finally came up, 4-3. And he jumped up and down and yelled, 7, there you are, a 7, I lose, a 7, 7. And he grabbed his shine box and he ran like hell. Thank you very much. You people are wonderful.